Well, tonight we're going to have the fellow that wrote about this fellow. This is Hippolyte Bouchard. Don't recall him from the trial we had this last month. One of the persons that motivated us is Mike Melzer, and he wrote a book, and he's going to be talking to us today. He's going to tell us how he got interested in Hippolyte Bouchard, what he did to learn about him, and I understand subsequent to writing the book, he's learned some additional materials. So I've been looking forward to hearing from him. Where's Mike? There he is. Come on up.
Excellent. Thank you for that introduction. Good evening, everyone. Many thanks to the Dana Point Historical Society for inviting me, and thank you all for coming. We'll go to the next slide, if you would, please. Excellent. Today, I'm here to talk about the most internationally interesting episode to happen in this state between the founding of the missions and the gold rush. I'm talking about the time that one Captain Bouchard brought revolution to Spanish California. From the Battle of Monterrey to the supply raid here at Capistrano, this was the only time that Latin America's wars of independence touched these shores. Now, some of you may have heard Bouchard described as California's only pirate. For decades, local events have portrayed him thusly, often in a manner reminiscent of a certain famous ride at nearby Disneyland. But as you shall see, here is a case where the real history is much more interesting than the myth. To understand it, we need to step back. For what happened here was not a foreign invasion, as some have described. It was not a pirate attack out of a Johnny Depp film either. It was an episode in a political and military conflict that saw the entire Spanish-speaking world torn apart. And as wars often do, this conflict brought participants from far afield. Nearly 20 years before the visit of Richard Henry Dana, some of the earliest Americans to set foot in California were those who served under Captain Bouchard in service of Latin American independence. Go to the next slide, please. First, let us introduce the captain, Hippolyte Bouchard. Bouchard's life could inspire multiple Hollywood epics, or maybe a novel by Joseph Conrad. The story of this cosmopolitan and controversial mariner is often forgotten, perhaps because he served more than one nation. He was transatlantic and pan-American. He considered himself a fighter against monarchy in favor of democracy. But he also embodied the contradictions of his time, especially when it came to issues like slavery. As a captain, he was fearless, self-assured, and had an authoritarian streak a mile wide. But nonetheless, he inspired enough loyalty that many men risked following him to the ends of the earth. Bouchard was very much a self-made man of his era. He was of humble origins, yet rose to great prominence through military efforts. While he's little remembered today, he crossed paths, and sometimes swords, with many of the legendary names of his era: Admiral Lord Nelson, General San Martin, and Simón Bolívar. Next slide. Hippolyte Bouchard grew up on the shores of Saint-Tropez, France. Back then, known more for fishermen than the jet set. But being a port city made it open to the world's affairs. In an era when travel by water was faster than by land, this made for a cosmopolitan place. Like the airports of today, port cities were hubs of connection, through which migration, trade, and most dangerously of all, ideas could be spread. Bouchard was surrounded by naval veterans who retold stories from the American War of Independence, where France had supported the insurgents of the 13 colonies. The French Revolution unfurled during Bouchard's adolescence, and it imprinted the ideas of popular sovereignty and an end to absolute monarchy. Back then, the man of the hour was Napoleon, who had demonstrated the power of meritocracy by rising to the top, despite his Corsican origins. The reaction from the other European powers was swift. A teenaged Bouchard learned the sounds of British cannons as they attacked the coast of France. As a young man, Bouchard was trained as an artilleryman in Napoleon's navy, but his career was full of misfortunes. His first commanding captain lost a leg to cannon fire, and later Bouchard participated in the disastrous French invasion of Haiti, where Napoleon brutally aimed to quash the largest slave rebellion since Spartacus. This marked Bouchard's first arrival to the Americas, where ironically he fought against a nation gaining its independence. Haiti eventually won its independence, making it the second country in the Americas to do so. And back in Europe, the Battle of Trafalgar decimated the French Navy. Bouchard never returned to his native France. Like a man without a country, he drifted across the Americas, eventually arriving to the port of Buenos Aires. The growing city of Buenos Aires lay on the shores of the Rio de la Plata, or River of Silver, reaching towards the South Atlantic. It was a place increasingly tied to trade with Europe, despite Spain's attempt to keep its colonies as a closed market. For a French immigrant such as Bouchard, the city carried the promise of great opportunity. Bouchard may have emigrated to the far side of the world, but even in South America, he could not escape the domino effects of Napoleon Bonaparte. When France invaded Spain and overthrew its king, it set off a chain of events in the Spanish-American colonies. Soon, local governments began to spring up, seeing an opportunity to pursue independence. In Buenos Aires, a revolution against Spanish rule began, and a new nation was born, the United Provinces of the Rio de la Plata, what we now call Argentina. Bouchard immediately joined the fight. Over the coming years, Bouchard captained a ship in the First Argentine Navy, and he helped defend Buenos Aires when it was bombarded from the water by Spanish ships. Later, he fought on land as a mounted grenadier under the famous General José de San Martín. By this time, Spain faced multiple insurgencies in its colonies, and the entire map of the Americas was being redrawn. Closer to home, Mexico was fighting too, but the rebels had not reached California. But Spain was not ready to give up. In 1815, Napoleon was defeated at Waterloo, and former monarchs were restored across Europe, including Fernando VII of Spain. Here we see Fernando VII, who returned to power after the defeat of Napoleon. Fernando was an arrogant, haughty king who believed innately in absolutist monarchy. I think his face in the paintings rather indicates this. In many ways, he embodied a Spanish empire that was steadfastly resistant to change. King Fernando vowed to restore control over the colonies at any cost. Back in South America, Argentina had already cleared the Rio de la Plata of Spanish ships. So, for the moment, there was no need for an expensive, full-time navy to maintain. But the need to fight Spanish forces elsewhere still existed. And so, Buenos Aires created an armada of privateers. So what are privateers? Privateers are privately owned ships that are armed and given license by a government to attack its enemies during wartime. These licenses are called letters of marque. It's a bit like legalized piracy, but it is still subject to the Articles of War. So imagine all the spirit of illicit adventure as with a pirate, but carried out in service of revolutionary ideals? It's no surprise that privateers, also known as corsairs, were romantic figures in the early 19th century, seen as the embodiment of free men attacking the unjust powers of empires. The United States had used privateers against Great Britain, especially in the War of 1812. Now, insurgent Argentina would use them against Spain. And in fact, many American veterans made their way to Buenos Aires to join the war. While some saw themselves as freedom fighters, a la 1776, others were rough mercenaries selling their skills. Thousands of American sailors would contribute to the wars of South American independence. Ironically, in Argentina, these Norteamericanos sometimes found themselves serving alongside many British veterans whom they had only recently fought. Captain Bouchard's naval training and blunt manner was a perfect fit for becoming a privateer captain. After first proving himself on a blockade of Peru, Bouchard planned an epic voyage like no other, to cross the world and hassle the Spanish Empire in its Pacific possessions, the Philippines, named for another Spanish king, and California. The captain assembled a tough and motley crew for this endeavor. Besides patriots from the Southern Cone, there were Portuguese, English, Africans, Spaniards, and North Americans. In the summer of 1817, they set sail from Buenos Aires, leaving on a frigate called La Argentina. This was the first voyage to bring the new rebel nation's flag across the globe. After crossing the Atlantic and rounding the Cape of Good Hope, Bouchard stopped for supplies in Madagascar, some of which he obtained by confronting 4 illegal slave-trading ships that were operating there. Newly independent Argentina had outlawed the slave trade. But there was still a vast distance left before the Philippines, with few options to resupply. Life at sea was always hard, but the voyage of La Argentina was particularly brutal. Soon, they were facing outbreaks of scurvy, with men dying every day. They were even attacked by pirates near Indonesia. Amazingly, after failing in their attack, some of these Moro pirates were incorporated into the crew to replace the men lost to scurvy. The cannons of La Argentina blasted the remainder into the sea. The unflappable Captain Bouchard sailed on, finally reaching the Philippines in January of 1818. By this time, after crossing half the planet, most aboard did not expect to survive the trip. Bouchard wrote that, "Even though I was left with few people after this painful voyage, we had all agreed to perish rather than fall into the hands of the Spaniards." In the coming weeks, La Argentina blockaded the port capital of Manila, sinking supply ships and weakening the military on shore. But Bouchard also lost many men in battle with Spanish forces. His second in command was even hacked to death with spears and swords. And La Argentina remained a ship in distress. Desperately in need of resupplying in a neutral territory, Bouchard finally sailed on to Hawaii. The Asian leg of the voyage had been a march through hell, but Bouchard's luck changed upon arrival to that picturesque archipelago in August of 1818. Incredibly, he discovered another Argentine privateer ship, the Santa Rosa, in the hands of Hawaii's King Kamehameha. It turned out that the Santa Rosa's crew had mutinied, sailed to Hawaii, and sold their ship to the king. Now these mutineers were living it up across the islands. Captain Bouchard was enraged when he heard this story, but he saw an opportunity. First, he negotiated with the king to buy the ship back for Argentina. And then, with Kamehameha's permission, Bouchard hunted down the mutineers across the Hawaiian Islands. At Kauai, their ringleader was executed, and many others were flogged. But, once again, some of these men were then able to join Bouchard's crews, with a promise to behave themselves better in the future. Remember, while Bouchard was a formally trained military man, His privateering crew included many raucous irregulars. Only someone with steely resolve could have kept any semblance of order in the face of so many hardships. When meting out punishments, Bouchard would hold the whip in one hand and a pistol in the other, likely as protection against possible mutiny. By this time, American sailors were already a common sight throughout Hawaii, and it was there that a famous early Anglo-American resident of California entered the narrative, Joseph Chapman. This tangent is worth mentioning, as for nearly 2 centuries, a story has circulated that Chapman was shanghaied into Bouchard's crew while in Hawaii. In truth, this would have only made sense if Chapman had been one of the dastardly mutineers who Bouchard had rounded up. But thanks to a recent discovery by a pair of Argentine researchers, we can now conclude that Mr. Chapman joined the rebel ships of his own free will. It can now be stated that Joseph Chapman had previously arrived to Hawaii on a Yankee merchant vessel called the Sultan, under one Captain Caleb Reynolds. On the Sultan's long voyage, there had not been much success in trading, and during a stop in Chile, many crew members had even deserted the ship and joined with South American privateers instead. So Joseph Chapman would have already been well aware of this as an option. In Hawaii, the ship Sultan crossed paths with La Argentina. Bouchard even asked for Captain Reynolds' support when he was busily recovering the Santa Rosa back from the king. The American merchant got on well with Bouchard, and they traded a large amount of goods between their ships. Captain Reynolds also introduced Bouchard to another American merchant we now know, the smuggler Captain Henry Geiselar. Together. Finally, in Captain Reynolds' log aboard the Sultan, dated August 24th, 1818, one can read this passage. This morning I settled with Mr. Chapman for his services, he having accepted of a commission under the flag of Buenos Aires, and this day entered upon duty aboard the Liberty. The Liberty was the original name of the ship Santa Rosa when it was built in Philadelphia. After 200 years, this should put to rest the question of just how Joseph Chapman joined Bouchard's crew. And so, with Chapman and others incorporated into a new crew, the Santa Rosa was again made ready for war on Spain. A plan to attack the coast of California began to take shape. Bouchard appointed an Englishman, Peter Corney, as captain of the Santa Rosa. Peter Corney knew California from previous visits here and could advise on the local geography and defenses. The diversity of the crew members continued to expand as dozens of native Hawaiians were added to both ships. The main objective was to be Monterey, capital of the province of Alta California. 200 years ago, California was not yet the Golden State. It was an undersupplied, frontier territory of the decaying Spanish Empire, an easy target for the privateers. On his mission here, Bouchard hoped to plunder Spanish property and ships, and if possible, start an uprising to revolutionize the province, perhaps even declare a California republic. Now, some have called Bouchard a pirate because his letters of marque technically expired during his trip to California. But he knew he was entering enemy territory for the remainder of the voyage, as this map demonstrates. And the Spanish government did not care about details like expiration dates. When caught, privateers were often executed without trial. Spain did not yet acknowledge Argentina as an independent country and could not have cared less about the dates on his papers. This is borne out by the fact that Bouchard would be called a pirate by Spanish authorities in California, even without their ability to know the status of his privateering license. And as both ships were Argentine property, upon the expiry of the letters of marque, Bouchard considered that his existing title as a captain of the Argentine Navy would serve as license enough for hostile actions against the enemy. So finally, La Argentina and the Santa Rosa sailed across the Pacific and stopped for supplies from the Russians up in Bodega Bay. Then it was time to enter Spanish California. On November 20th, 1818, Bouchard's 2 ships arrived to Monterey Bay and were immediately spotted by sentries on land. The arrival was brought to the attention of Spanish Governor Pablo Vicente de Solá, who ruled from the Presidio of Monterey. Bouchard sent the Santa Rosa towards the shore, flying the American flag. As their goal was a surprise attack, what better way than to pretend the Santa Rosa was a Yankee merchant coming to trade? When local men ashore yelled in Spanish for the ship to identify itself, the crew replied in English to confound them. Unfortunately for the privateers, there was a catch. As it turned out, that American smuggler, Captain Geiselar, was friendly with some of the authorities here in California. After having dined with Bouchard and Captain Reynolds back in Hawaii, he warned California about the plan. So Governor Solá had already prepared this territory for the arrival of these 2 ships, who were not what they seemed. It may not have been a surprise attack, but for Bouchard's men, there was no turning back. The wars of independence had arrived to California. What followed became known as the Battle of Monterey. The next morning, for 2 hours, cannonballs flew between the Santa Rosa and the coastal defenses of Monterey, leaving her heavily damaged, with 5 of the crew dead. Much of the crew members began evacuating the ship on small boats, heading for the safety of La Argentina, anchored further out. The Californian soldiers yelled demands that the men surrender to them, or they would sink the ship outright. 3 men rowed ashore to be taken prisoner by the Spanish. Among them was Joseph Chapman. Bouchard was undaunted by the first day's losses, and the following morning he landed 200 men plus artillery and marched on Monterey. Soon, Governor Solá and his men fled inland, taking Chapman and the other prisoners with them. Some locals wanted to hang the prisoners immediately, but cooler heads prevailed. At the fortification looking over Monterey, a Hawaiian islander pulled down the Spanish flag, and the Argentine flag was raised over the capital of California. It was a victory for the rebels. While Bouchard's crews resupplied the ships with everything they could find, the captain demanded that his 3 prisoners be returned, or else he threatened to burn Monterey. Governor Solá never even replied, while he waited for reinforcements to arrive from Southern California. Captain Bouchard was furious. After 5 days awaiting an answer, he called in the threat, and much of the Presidio was put to the torch, though Bouchard made sure that no one touched the Presidio's church. After all, this was only a war between governments. After occupying Monterey for 6 days, Bouchard had made his point. The main goal of privateering was to bleed the enemy of resources, rather than to actually conquer areas and hold them. So after capturing California's capital, the remainder of Bouchard's time here was focused on the constant need of resupplying such massive ships. Meanwhile, word of Monterey's fall had spread like wildfire across California, and preparations for war went into high gear. One mission padre described Bouchard's men as the godless insurgents of Buenos Aires, and the vicars formed paramilitary groups of Native American neophytes to train to fight Bouchard's men should they land again. And land they did, at the Rancho Refugio near Santa Barbara, home of the prosperous Ortega family, who had a reputation themselves as smugglers. While Bouchard's crews resupplied with what they could find, 3 more of his men were captured by the Spanish forces, who were lurking behind the trees. Bouchard's reply was to burn the ranch. After losing 3 crew to the Spanish at Monterey, he was not about to leave men behind for a second time. The 2 ships sailed to the nearest military outpost, the Presidio of Santa Barbara, and negotiated a prisoner exchange under a flag of truce. The local commandant was irritated to discover Bouchard only had one prisoner to exchange for 3 crew members. But considering that Bouchard could have taken Santa Barbara by force, he magnanimously agreed, while Bouchard agreed to no further hostile actions in California. His men safely back aboard, La Argentina and the Santa Rosa continued south. The logistics for the Spanish authorities in defense of colonial California were very difficult. They had to stretch limited resources over a vast distance, while the insurgents had the advantage of rapid movement by sail. Californian reinforcements were sent to this direction, but it would take them time to arrive. But the ships brought their own limitations just as insurmountable, that constant need for supplies to ward off a possible mutiny. On December 15th, today's data point was in sight, and one of the few landing spots remaining in California lay beyond. If there were any more supplies to be had, this would have to do. Bouchard had agreed to no further hostilities, and so, out of respect for that agreement, the ships anchored under a flag of truce. Spotting the arrival of the insurgents, 30-odd local defenders under Sergeant Santiago Arguello knew they were at a disadvantage. Under the auspices of the mission friars, locals were evacuated to the adobe rancho in Trabuco Canyon, bringing the most valuable items from Mission Capistrano with them. Bouchard sent an emissary ashore with a list of demands, but they were hardly the golden booty of pirate lore. After announcing that his ships were at war with Spain, he asked those ashore for 20 sacks of potatoes, 10 sacks of corn, and 4 head of cattle to feed his crews. He described the proposal as reasonable and humane, but having nothing to trade in return, these items would need to be furnished under threat of war. Demanding supplies to keep the men on board alive is hardly an unrestrained act of war, but it could certainly be interpreted as a violation of his earlier promise, despite the white flag. But there was every reason to expect Bouchard would peacefully sail on if the supplies had been provided. Instead, his heavy-handed attempt at parley was met with intransigence. The reply given by local Sergeant Arguello was darkly humorous. If Bouchard wanted to come ashore, the only provisions available were powder and shot. Perhaps Sergeant Arguello expected the reinforcements to arrive in time to justify his bluster, but for now it was a foolish response, considering that the local defenders at that moment were vastly outnumbered by Bouchard's forces. Bouchard was particularly annoyed by the reply. He decided to send forces ashore the following day to take supplies by force, and appointed Peter Corney to lead the incursion. Early the next morning, December 16th, 100 men were landed near today's Doheny State Beach. Desperate to make some semblance of a defense, Sergeant Arguello took his soldiers towards the landing area and began firing at the arriving insurgents, but there was no chance of victory. The local defenders quickly retreated inland, while the boats landed the groups of men under Corney's command, bringing with them 2 small field artillery pieces. Walking in formation, these men followed the creek towards the area of Mission Capistrano and arrived to the main plaza by mid-morning. Having faced no further resistance, the men first celebrated by preparing a hearty breakfast with what they found handy. Peter Corney then gave the orders to search the various buildings and stores and to seize whatever supplies could be found. As with Monterey, the only area off limits was the mission church. To the men's delight, a large quantity of wine and spirit was soon uncovered. While Sergeant Arguello and his troops watched from a distant hill, many of Bouchard's men grew increasingly drunk and began setting fires. Peter Corney had proven himself unsuited to the task of keeping order. Returning to the ships now became a slog, as some men were so drunk they were fastened to the field pieces, and pushed along the trail back towards the beach. The men brought with them whatever supplies they could carry, scattering cargo along the way in their condition. Meanwhile, 4 of the crew stayed behind as deserters, hiding themselves during the messy departure. Their motives for desertion are unknown, but the deprivation of life at sea was intense, and the voyage had been filled with hardships. And so, what passed into local legend as a pirate attack would best be described as a supply raid that lost discipline, and a situation that was arguably made worse by the military pride of the local defenders. Meanwhile, those men who returned to the ships intoxicated must have surely expected a frosty reception from Bouchard, the military-trained disciplinarian. They were allowed to sleep it off, perhaps so that they would remember the consequences with the full pain of the next morning's hangover. And indeed, the following day, in very un-piratey fashion, about 20 men were flogged as punishment for their drunken actions. By now, Bouchard had realized that 4 men were still missing. Assuming they'd been taken prisoner, he demanded their return, but a new message from shore finally told of their desertion. At this point, some reinforcements had finally arrived, but too late to make a difference to the outcome. And so, under cover of night, the 2 ships sailed away from Alta California forever, continuing on to attack Central America before ending the voyage the following summer in Chile. Bouchard could claim some success in the war against Spain in California, but there had been no uprising. So why didn't California join the revolution against Spain? Well, first of all, most of the population here was Native American, and the new republics of the Americas did not treat them as equals any more than the Spaniards did. So there was no reason for them to join with Bouchard. And second, the local Europeans were mostly made up of Spanish soldiers and mission padres. In other words, people very loyal to their Iberian homeland. So, when locals returned to the evacuated towns throughout California, the Spanish flag was quickly raised again. In San Juan Capistrano, a round of finger-pointing commenced between the military and religious authorities over who was most at fault for the melee. Alta California's placid bubble had been burst. The old ways would not endure. And just 3 years later, the Spanish flag was brought down forever, as Mexico achieved its independence and incorporated Alta California into its territory. And let us not forget the case of Joseph Chapman. Chapman remained in California as a Spanish prisoner until a general amnesty was issued. Incredibly, he later married into the Ortega family, whose ranch had been burned by Bouchard's men. The story of him having been forced into Bouchard's service may likely have originated with Chapman himself. But this would make perfect sense. As a former prisoner, an Anglo-American out of place in colonial California, and the first English-speaking resident of Los Angeles, he would have had every reason to explain away his past actions in this way, if only to get along better with any locals who might still harbor suspicions of him. But now we know the real story. Chapman willingly chose to side with the privateers back in Hawaii, and he went on to become one of the most prolific citizens of early California. Chapman designed and helped build 2 new mills for the missions, the Plaza Church roof in Los Angeles, and one of the first ships ever to be built in California. Not bad for a man once slandered as a pirate. Meanwhile, Captain Bouchard went on to continue the war against Spain in Chile and later Peru, but is still most associated with Argentina. Bouchard and the independence movements forever changed the map of the Americas. Later in his life, upon his retirement from the Peruvian Navy, Bouchard was granted 2 struggling haciendas in Peru, which included several hundred slaves who toiled for the cultivation of pisco brandy, sugar, and cotton. As a ship captain, Bouchard had been known for his tough approach to discipline, and this trait carried over into his last position as a plantation owner. In 1837, in the desolate valley of San Javier, Bouchard's tumultuous life came to an end. One evening, 5 slaves took him by surprise and murdered him. Bouchard was hastily buried in a decaying former Jesuit mission. His story was a rags-to-riches tale of pluck, bravado, and adversity. Yet, a man who declared himself a fighter for liberty nevertheless died at the hands of other men, unjustly under his own yoke. With this, Bouchard embodied the contradictions of the new republics of North and South America. Despite the idealistic language of equality and democracy, there were many aspects of the old colonial order that would prove slow to change. But even in death, Bouchard was not fated to stay in one country. 125 years after his burial in Peru, in 1962, his remains were brought back to Argentina with great fanfare. In today's Argentina, there are monuments, schools, plazas, streets, even a town named for Bouchard. In Hawaii, he has been written about as a pirate hunter. And all the way back in his French hometown, a statue stands watch, here recently visited by the wife of President Macron, and a dock at Saint-Tropez is named in Bouchard's honor. Yet here in California, a pirate myth grew around his name. In Orange County, already in the 19th century, increasingly elaborate stories were told of the events. There was even a myth of buried treasure left behind in Rancho Trabuco. Last fall marked the bicentennial of Bouchard's arrival to California. It is therefore the perfect time for a reevaluation of Bouchard's legacy here. Of course, the Californians loyal to Spain bravely did their part to defend the territory from what they considered a threat. But it's now been 2 centuries that only one side of the perspective has dominated local memory. I'd say it's high time the privateers got their due in California as well. This past November, and with the help of the Dana Point Historical Society, Bouchard was finally put on trial in San Juan Capistrano, and both the mock jury and the audience declared him to be a patriot, acting on behalf of Argentina. The thorny captain provided a noteworthy episode, which links California to the Pan-American Wars of Independence. Hopefully, I've convinced you all. If you can read in Spanish, the Argentine historians I mentioned, Alejandro and Mariana Rossi Belgrano, have published 2 volumes of new discoveries regarding Bouchard's famous voyage around the world. They're working on bringing out a 3rd that will cover California. I also heavily recommend you check out the website Visions of California by Eric Plunkett, who spoke here last year. He gets into the raid on Capistrano with a stunning amount of detail. Bouchard's story has more twists and turns than what I've been able to touch upon tonight. My own book, The Patriot Pirate, gives an account of his fascinating life, alongside many illustrations by the artist Phoebe Herring. I hope you've all been drawn in by this enigmatic captain and his encounter with local history. I'm happy to answer any questions you may have, and if I do not know the answer, I'll happily try to make something up. Thank you all for listening.
Anyone have any questions?
Yeah, right.
How large a crew did he have on the ships?
It was, with the frigate, the Argentina, it was around 200 people, as I recall. The Santa Rosa was small, it was about 100. But yeah, these were floating small cities, really. It's amazing how much logistics were involved.
Yeah.
How large are those ships then?
Oh, I'm bad on the metrics of all of that. Sizable, a good 100, 150 feet. Someone here might actually know the answer to that better than me. Any other questions? Yes, ma'am.
For financial support, where did he get his money to support 200 men on board?
It was basically, they left with as many supplies as they could, and then the rules of privateering were such that whatever you could get, you would divide it up amongst the crew and the captain and the person who owned the ship. Everybody would get a different share. But in this case, they had very little luck, considering how many ports of call they made it. It was pretty much always just raiding to get supplies as much as they could. And let's say if they could get something from one island, trade it for something they had brought maybe with them from Argentina, then the next island, maybe that's the thing that they're looking for. So there were a lot of deals, such as like in Hawaii, the American captains, there was a lot of back and forth like between what he traded with the Hawaiians, what he would get back in return, and then trade to these other merchants that would be, it was very convoluted, but a mix of barter and pillage, basically, would be how I'd describe it. Yes?
So there was no currency at that time in most of these places? Everything was pretty much on the barter system?
It was, I mean, there was a currency, and actually it was interesting to see that a lot of the people were paid in different currencies even. In Buenos Aires, there were some being paid in US dollars, and in Baltimore, there was a lot of recruiting going on, and a lot of people don't remember, in the early days of the United States, for several decades, Spanish dollars from the colonies were legal tender in the U.S. So sometimes they would be paid in dollars, and sometimes, somebody would come up from a South American city to Baltimore or New Orleans, New York, and just look recruiting for tough guys, and they maybe only had Spanish dollars, but that would work. If you could give something to your wife or what have you in the States.
Bouchard's people, the crew, that they never had any currency on them or wouldn't steal currency?
I mean, certainly they were open to stealing currency if they could find it.
Yeah.
But here in California, for example, because they knew they had that advance notice, all of the good stuff like that had already been taken away, hidden, buried, what have you. But yes, they left. They had a safe on board, and there was a good quantity that they left with, as buy off money for what have you for such a long voyage. But yeah, it really they did not, for all the effort they put into it, they really did not get a lot back in the end. You're kind of rolling the dice, and they had a hard trip.
Do we know why he was murdered?
It does. I've read a lot more. New documents have actually come to light fairly recently that were some correspondence that he did with brothers of his back in France. And through that, we now have a little bit clearer that there was a bit of a political situation in Peru at the time where a new dictator had taken over and was conscripting slaves from different properties and such into the army, or his personal army, let's say. And essentially, Bouchard hid his slaves in the mountains to avoid them being taken in with this system. And he was apparently, Bouchard, an enemy of this dictator. But then after the slaves returned, they had a little taste of freedom, and they were less willing to do the job. And the fact that they had been gone all that time had made the land and the state of things deteriorate just enough that it seems that they entered sort of a spiral of worse and worse returns. And I would guess that probably Bouchard became more and more of a hardliner, and essentially it's probably just a bit of a provocation on his part. As he was 57 years old. 56 actually, because he wouldn't have turned yet.
Where do you get most of your research? From Europe or from the United States things?
Oh, it's been quite a journey all around the world on this a little bit. I've gone a lot in California. I've gotten quite a bit from the Bancroft Library up in Berkeley. A lot of secondary published sources, and then in Buenos Aires, I've visited a few archives down there. I've also sent out for material. I've gotten a lot of stuff from Hawaii. Has quite a few letters back and forth from when he was there. And interestingly enough, I didn't mention it because it's a contentious issue, let's say. The history is not settled. But there is a strand of Argentinian historians that consider the accords that King Kamehameha made in Hawaii with Bouchard to be the first recognition of Argentina's independence by a foreign power, which is it becomes a contentious thing because Bouchard was not a state representative in the right credential and so on. So you could argue both ways, but it's one of the interesting tangents.
He still had his letter.
Right. There was basically an accord that was made with Kamehameha and Bouchard, celebrating the great friendship now between the Kingdom of Hawaii and the new Republic of Argentina. Yeah, history is always more interesting than fiction.
Did Bouchard have a family?
He did, and actually that's another story that has been very shrouded in mystery over the years. When he was in Buenos Aires, making his way at the beginning, he married into a wealthy family, actually, a daughter of a famous merchant that was very politically connected there. And his wife's name was Norberta. They had one daughter while he was still in Buenos Aires in the early army in Argentina. And Norberta was pregnant with a second daughter when Bouchard left on the trip around the world. And for a long and convoluted series of events, in Argentina, the political situation became unstable by the time Bouchard's voyage had ended. And essentially there was a disagreement between the independent people in Chile, the independent people in Argentina. There was a whole mess of confusion over who was in charge in different areas. And to make a long story short, he never returned to Argentina. And there's a lot of different theories as to why that is. One of them includes that he's just SOB, but also there's a lot of political intrigue and such going on because she was very much of a political family of Buenos Aires and would have had probably little interest to move to Peru where he ended up being. But it does seem that it would have been dangerous for Bouchard to go himself back to Argentina because the faction of sort of the early independent leadership, including General San Martin himself, at a certain point had become persona non grata with new leaders that had taken over, and it's a very kind of balkanized situation when you get into some of the South American politics. There's more that has come to light more recently that I've heard about. I've not seen the evidence that there have been new letters uncovered between Norberta and Bouchard in his later years that I'm sure would shed some light on this, but I have not seen the actual evidence myself, so I don't want to comment on it. But I think it is a common trait of maritime figures in general.
When you get followed.
And he was more macho than the most macho, you could argue, I guess.
You
Yes.
said Chapman came back to Los Angeles. What happened? I didn't pick up on what happened to him or.
Well, he made it all over the state, actually. He was, after he was taken prisoner, they kind of realized, it seems, that he could be of use with his carpentry and so on. So he was moved around while he was still officially a prisoner, and he worked on some of those projects for the missions and such in that capacity. And then, I'm blogging on the year, but there was a general amnesty as the wars of independence were coming to a close, and Spain was, eventually relinquishing their colonies. There was a general amnesty issued for prisoners, and so Chapman at that point was a free man again, and he made it to Santa Barbara at some point because he married into the Ortegas. But I know that after he was free, he was considered the first English-speaking resident of Los Angeles. But LA, as I've come to understand, LA in the time that he was there was very rugged and actually had a sort of epidemic of violence. So he may have left for greener pastures or a more peaceful area, because Santa Barbara was a lot more under control, being a military outpost. Yes?
What piqued your interest in Bouchard?
Oh, it was a long story with that too. I think I moved out here about 20 years ago, and actually my partner in crime that I've lived with is Argentinian, And I learned pieces of the puzzle over the time. I would see, like in Santa Barbara, they have all the flags that have flown over California. And I saw the Argentine flags. What's that all about? So this was before, Wikipedia and all that existed. So it was very slow to try to, search on the internet or ask people at historical sites and such like for information. But I just sort of went down the rabbit hole with it. So over time, I just started accumulating more and more books and data and improving my Spanish recognition. And yeah, it's been almost 10 years probably since I first got into it. But yeah, I originally had thought to make a documentary about Bouchard because I'm more trained as a video guy originally. And when I realized the costs it would take to make it done right, I settled on hiring an illustrator to bring it to life that way.
The other question is, if Bouchard was brought to trial when he returned to Central America, what happened on that trial and why was he convicted or not convicted?
Right, so that is another, talk about the Balkan politics of South America at that time. So Chile had declared its independence and had achieved its independence, Argentina as well, and they had already started coordinating quite a few actions. And so, the same is true of the area of Venezuela, Colombia in the north of South America. So the real headquarters that was left of Spanish was in Peru. And so the idea was that there would be this massive Chilean-Argentinian army coming from the south to Peru and a northern army led by Bolivar coming from the north to finally quash the Spanish. But as you can imagine, they're having to leave from the Pacific ports of Chile. And so Chile, they don't know the Argentinians as well. The Argentinians are sort of there as guests, collaborators, but they're also seen as foreigners in many respects. So and everybody is suspicious of any ship that comes because the Spanish all know that they're planning something and these guys are trying to get this armada together. And the Chilean forces hire Lord Cochrane, who had been a major figure in the British Royal Navy and then had fallen out of favor, had been disgraced. So he made his way to wherever he would get hired. So Lord Cochrane, he also is interested in just this glorious moment in which he can sort of regain his name and get as many ships together, and if they can liberate Peru, he's going to be in good graces again, maybe, internationally. So into this maelstrom of complicated politics, Bouchard and his ships were coming off of their privateer voyage. They were confident they would be treated well because they're landing in an independent-held Argentine allied city. And as it happens, because Bouchard was not the first of his ships to arrive, the ones that arrived before him, people are looking at it as, who are these guys? Like, nobody knows who they are. They say they came from Argentina, but the guys like English, they've got crews from Hawaii, like, these guys must be pirates or something. So basically, I would say just because of Bouchard not arriving in time to explain everything, that's the start of the problem, because then when Bouchard gets there and sees that his crew has been impounded, the other ship is impounded, he thought maybe the Spanish had taken over again. He didn't know what was going on, and he was such a tempestuous, big-temper guy. When they came to ask him about things, he was already with his men armed and all this. So then it created a diplomatic incident because Bouchard had disrespected Lord Cochrane's emissaries that had come aboard to figure out what was going on. And so Bouchard was thrown in prison, and while he was in prison, essentially a laundry list of people who had gripes with him started bringing out things like, hey, I heard he robbed a ship in Suriname, and I heard he stole some tobacco off a ship in Indonesia, and all these people started making complaints. They had captured another ship while they were in Central America, and the captain claimed that his ship was not a legitimate capture, that he was just a Danish captain and he was there. So it was this long, convoluted thing. But ultimately, the goal was most likely Lord Cochrane wanting to get the ships and just impress them into his fleet however he could. But because Bouchard was well respected and well known to many of the higher ups that were also working to plan this operation, They finally were able to put in enough word, maybe behind the scenes. So the trial ended in him being acquitted of piracy, and he was released. And but unfortunately, by that point, during the trial, Lord Cochrane had stripped the ships of armaments and so on and so forth. So essentially, Bouchard was freed of piracy, but he now had two ships that were of no use, and so he was forced to essentially just rent them out as transport ships for the big expedition that was being planned. But yeah, it's one could write a whole book on just the vicissitudes of the trial of Bouchard. It's so convoluted.
So, Michael, is it really possible that those cannonballs that Bob has framed could really go back to Bouchard's raid?
I'm going to sidestep that question because I am not an armaments guy, not a munitions expert at all, but certainly from the period. So the imagination runs wild. It'd be nice to think that is true.
So,
certainly.
Everyone should see those when we're downstairs in the museum, because there are Bob.
Two cannonballs, one's lead and one's lead. The lead one was found on Bluefin, and the steel one was found at River Road at the creek bed.
Yeah.
And then there's also some grape shot there.
Grape shot is from back east. That's unrelated.
Yeah.
Is there any other question that we need to have answered for the good of the whole, or we can continue to talk to Michael downstairs and we
The
can
book's
talk to
for
him about
sale, and how much? The book is for
Books,
sale?
the book will be for sale downstairs, $20, and I'll happily sign it over to you.
Great. And I also wanted to call attention to the fact that we have two guests. One with us this evening. One was a speaker last year that Michael referred to. Eric Plunkett is here. He helped tell us that the Droger statue is near where the hides were thrown off the bluff. Eric, you want to stand and say hello? And Phil Brigandy is here, and Phil is planning, actually Phil and Eric and a number of other people in the Orange County Historical Society are planning an event this summer. And would you like to say a few words about that, Phil?
Sure, thank you.
Sure.
So the Ortega Ranch, which somehow didn't get burned by Bouchard, but we won't speculate on that, goes back to Jose Francisco Ortega Highway, who was the scout for the Portola expedition in 1769. See how I did that? Great, thank you. This year, we just did 200th for Bouchard. This year we do 250th for the first Spanish overland expedition to California. The Orange County Historical Society is marking this with a bus tour along the approximate route of the expedition through Orange County, a full-day trip, San Clemente to La Habra, with stops along the way, and talks by historians and a guidebook. And then on Sunday, we'll be going north into Los Angeles County, continuing through the Puente Hills with another event at the Workman Temple Homestead in the City of Industry. So we have a whole weekend planned to mark what is really a turning point in California history. If you're interested, reservations are filling up fast, but you can go to the Orange County Historical Society's website, orangecountyhistory.org, and you can sign up there and join us on Saturday, July 27th. Thanks.
Thank you. Another round of applause here today. I want to mention one other thing in my brief announcements, and that is that Terry and Lee Walsh are also giving walking tours this Saturday and Sunday, weather permitting, and the tour meets at 2 o'clock, Terry, at Coastal Kitchen. So if you haven't done that walking tour, do it. It's good. And you'll either learn a lot or you'll be refreshed with your local history. So on that note, please join us for some beverages and snacks downstairs and further conversation. Yeah, open up the door, yeah. That was interesting.
Yeah, very much.